2022 is going to end up being a noteworthy year for Metroid fans. It's the 35th anniversary of the original Metroid's release on the NES, the 20th anniversary of the original Metroid Prime, and the 15th anniversary of the end of the original Prime trilogy. Just before the beginning of the year, Nintendo released the first original 2D Metroid game in almost 2 decades, and by the end of the year it will release the first new Metroid Prime game in a decade and a half, at least according to Amazon. And all this has got me thinking about the trilogy of games that this new Metroid will ostensibly be based on. I think about Metroid Prime a lot in any case. It's probably the best video game trilogy, not just as a whole, but also at each stage in its development, of any that I've ever played. Which is weird, because it's also not really a trilogy. Oh, don't get me wrong, Prime certainly lives up to the standard Hollywood/AAA gaming definition of the word, which is more or less 3 things that have the same name attached to them. But that has much more to do with how works of fiction are marketed than what they actually are. I've never heard anyone describe the first 3 Super Mario games as a trilogy, even though they're literally named Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario Bros. 3. When we use the word trilogy, there's a sense that the 3 parts add up to something greater than they are individually, and generally what they add up to is a single overarching story. The 3 Lord of the Rings books tell one story about the war between Sauron and the races of Middle-earth. The first book begins with a hobbit picking up the One Ring in the Shire, and the last one ends, kind of, with him destroying it in Mount Doom. Star Wars, another famous trilogy, tells the story of the Galactic Rebellion's fight to destroy an evil empire, and each movie picks up where the last one left off story-wise. A lot happens between the beginning and the end in both trilogies, but we never lose sight of the major players and the basic underlying conflict that drives them. Now, since video games have a lot more to them than the story, you might say that the coherence of the overarching plot is less important for video game trilogies than those in book or movie form. And to a certain extent, that's true. Resident Evil 3 has the same structure and mechanics as 1 and 2, but it would be a stretch to say the story is heavily tied into the events of either. Doom 3 has a strong story focus, but it's not a continuation of Doom 2. In fact, if anything, it's more of a soft reboot of the original Doom. Having a 3 at the end of its title is generally more of an indicator of overall design, and less a promise that any epic multi-game story is being told. Even so, game series that are described as a trilogy by their creators generally are story-focused and follow a similar pattern. At the beginning of Halo, humanity is engaged in a devastating war with the Alien Covenant, and later in the same game we encounter a parasitic hive mind called the Flood. By the end of Halo 3, the war with the Covenant is over, and the Flood has been contained. Mass Effect, another well-known game trilogy, starts with the discovery of the horrifying Eldritch Reapers, and ends with the Reapers being destroyed, albeit in a way that completely throws out the rest of the story. Look, I'm not saying a trilogy has to be 100% good to qualify for the title. It doesn't even need to have a satisfying beginning or ending, because the triloginess of it has more to do with how the parts in between fit together than how good the finished product is. And although Metroid Prime is very good, one of the best series in the history of gaming, it has very little of the connective tissue that makes a trilogy a trilogy. To show you what I mean, here are 3 elements, appropriately enough, that every part of a series needs in order to make the whole thing feel like an ongoing story. Shared plot elements, shared characters, and continuous plot development from one entry to the next. Taking Star Wars as an example, there are many shared plot elements between episodes 4 and 6, like characters using the Force, space travel, Imperial attacks on rebel bases, and the protagonists being captured by their enemies only to escape later on. When it comes to shared characters, Star Wars is equally strong. Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, R2-D2, C-3PO, and Darth Vader appear in all 3 films, and almost the entire major cast appears in at least 2. That leaves continuous plot development, and here again it comes through. The Empire Strikes Back takes place 3 years after the events of A New Hope, but plot-wise it picks up right where the last one left off. Leia is still leading the rebellion from a secret base, Han is still being chased by bounty hunters sent by Jabba the Hutt, and Luke is still learning how to use the Force. With Return of the Jedi, the connection is even stronger. The story starts with Luke trying to rescue Han, who was captured at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. The story isn't strictly continuous because there are time gaps, but the things happening in the 3rd movie are a direct consequence of what happened in the 2nd and the 1st. Now let's apply those same details to the Prime trilogy. The shared plot element that holds the 3 Prime games together is the existence of Phazon, a deadly mutagen which Samus discovers in the first game and which is literally sucked out of the universe at the end of the 3rd. In Metroid Prime, we find out that Samus's old enemies, the space pirates, are experimenting with Phazon as a means of creating powerful bioweapons, most of which Samus blows up over the course of the game. In the final entry, Corruption, Samus travels to worlds even more thoroughly permeated with the stuff than Talon 4 was, and finally tracks it down to its source and destroys it. But there's something missing from this equation. The second game, Echoes. Echoes' story is based on the light-dark duality of the planet Ether, and the Luminoth's fight against the Ing for control of the planet's energy. It isn't really related to the overall plot about Phazon at all. But wait, I hear you say. Dark Ether was created by a Phazon meteor, and there's Phazon all over the place. Doesn't that make it connected? Well, sure it does. Technically. But the problem is that it has no plot relationship with the other games. In the first Metroid Prime, there's an obvious theme of mutation, especially in the latter half of the game when you reach the Phazon mines. The most frightening enemies in the game are those with the most exposure to Phazon, and even Samus gets infected by it after defeating the Omega Pirate, the ultimate example of space pirate technology interfacing with Phazon's mutagenic qualities. Metroid Prime, the final boss, is a Metroid that's absorbed so much Phazon that it's become a grotesque abomination, and in the final fight it mutates into other bizarre forms right before your eyes. You get a real sense that Phazon is not some ordinary toxic substance. Combined with the criminal impulses of the space pirates, or the mindless aggression of a Metroid, it's an existential threat to life across the universe. Echoes simply doesn't pick up this thread. The major plot device of Echoes is the Ing's ability to possess other creatures, which technically does mutate them, but it has nothing to do with the properties of Phazon. Phazon is in Echoes, but it doesn't do anything. Instead, the Ing are the galactic menace Samus has to stop. Speaking of the Ing, let's talk about shared characters for a moment here. Fleshed-out characters are a rarity in the Metroid series. Arguably, Samus is the most developed of any of them, and in many games, even she doesn't have much of a personality. So in those games, including the original Metroid Prime, the number of characters could be considered to be 0. But let's interpret the concept of character a little more broadly here. In the first Prime game, you read lore left by both the Chozo and the Space Pirates, and the personality type of these two races is quite clear. The Chozo are thoughtful, sensitive, and poetic, while the Space Pirates are power-hungry, brutal, and materialistic. I would argue that both of these groups constitute a character, so that a fair interpretation would give us 3 characters in Prime: the Chozo, the Space Pirates, and Samus herself. It's worth noting that one of these characters has no direct interaction with the other two. The Chozo are long dead by the time Samus arrives on Talon 4, and although they foresee the coming of both Samus and the Space Pirates, they don't live to see either. The Space Pirates' attitude serves as a foil to the Chozos, and occasionally the pirates disparage them or complain about being unable to understand their technology, but the conflict, such as it is more of a moral debate than an actual fight. Another character, Samus, is essentially silent, meaning that the primary observable plot developments in Metroid Prime are the pirates reacting to Samus. Prime actually does a pretty good job making this interesting, both plot-wise and mechanically, but it's a very thin foundation to build an epic multi-game story out of. So maybe it shouldn't be that surprising that Echoes didn't even try. Echoes translates the indirect conflict of the Chozo and Space Pirates into a literal war between the Luminoth and the Ing. So again we have 3 characters, but 2 of them are different, meaning there's no way to have a character relationship that evolves from one story to the next. Echoes' story is almost entirely self-contained, with very few connections to the first game and literally none to the third. Ah, but hold on, you say. What about Dark Samus? I think it's pretty well known at this point that Dark Samus is basically Metroid Prime after absorbing Samus's Phazon suit from the first game. So yes, technically we have a grand total of 2 shared characters across the entire trilogy. Except that Dark Samus isn't a character. She, or maybe I should say it, doesn't talk, doesn't interact with Samus except to fight, and only has an evil plan in the broadest possible sense of the word. Even the vague sense of interaction you get with the Space Pirates in the first game isn't present with Dark Samus. She shows up, you fight her, and you move on. There's no real storytelling going on. So does that make Dark Samus a shared plot element, rather than a shared character? Frankly, no. She doesn't work as that either. Metroid Prime doesn't show up until the end of its eponymous game, which means it isn't really involved in the plot. Dark Samus shows up more in the third game, where I think you could legitimately call her behavior the driver of the plot, but as before, it's the middle entry that sinks it. Echoes is the game that introduced Dark Samus, but it also doesn't involve her in the plot at all. She has no place in the conflict between the Luminoth and the Ing. Her only goal is to absorb energy from Phazon, which, as I mentioned before, the Ing don't use or interact with. Your fights with her don't have anything to do with the story. In fact, they show up more or less at random. Rather than having a story that interweaves the War on Aether with overarching themes from the rest of the series, Echoes spends 5% of the time telling a story about Dark Samus trying to kill you, or in other words, 5% of its time actually furthering the plot, and the other 95% telling a totally different story that's wrapped up with no loose ends by the time the game is over. So the only real shared major character is a silent protagonist. The sole shared plot element is virtually written out of the second installment. And as for continuity between the games, that's virtually non-existent. The sole point of continuity is the existence of Dark Samus, a nebulous character who can't talk and whose goals are only ever really hinted at. This is what I'm getting at when I say that Metroid Prime isn't a trilogy. And actually, when you realize that the series doesn't quite work as a trilogy, many things about it start to make more sense. Why does Metroid Prime work so well as a standalone experience, and feel really different from both Echoes and Corruption? Because from the very beginning it was a self-contained experience, not an attempt to set up a longer story. Why do the space pirates play such a small role in Echoes' story? Because the goal was never to set up a saga featuring the space pirates and their use of Phazon, it was just to make interesting Metroid games with unique stories. And here's the sad one. Why is Corruption still, to this day, generally considered inferior to the other two? Why was it so linear and expository? Why did the Aurora unit talk your ear off all the time? It's because, for the first time in 5 years, the development team actually started to take the idea of a trilogy seriously, and they realized that the story had a lot of catching up to do. Basically, Corruption ended up having 2.5 games worth of plot points, because the previous entries did so little to advance the story. The story of the Metroid Prime series is the story of a trilogy that no one tried to make happen until it was too late. It's the story of a development team that wasn't interested in telling a story until suddenly it was. It's the story of a fascinating premise that went nowhere for a whole game and then gave itself a heart attack trying to make up for lost time. And despite that, it's one of the best video game series ever, and a personal favorite of mine. So while we're waiting for Prime 4 to make its debut, I'm going to cover this trilogy from a new angle and see what I come up with. This series of 3 videos, technically 4 counting this introduction, is also something of a rebuttal to other videos I've seen analyzing the Prime series, in particular the ones from Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit. Watching his videos recently made me realize just how many people see Metroid as a mechanical experience first, and a story second. And while that's a perfectly legitimate way to analyze the series, I think it misses out on a lot of the appeal of these games. I have nothing against Mark Brown, by the way. He's a great content creator. I'm simply going to use his arguments as a jumping-off point to discuss the series. His videos are very methodical, which makes them easy to respond to. They're excellent fodder, in other words. At the end of the day, my goal here is not so much to prove anyone else wrong, as just to share the special feeling that I had playing these games. A feeling which, judging by my recent experience replaying them on the Virtual Console, is still pretty strong even after all these years. The Prime series may not really be a trilogy, especially after 4 comes out, but what it is, unquestionably, is a series of masterpieces. And I'll drink to that.